Hello and welcome to The Booking Club, the podcast that brings you today's leading authors and commentators from a table at their favourite places to eat and drink. I'm your host, Jack Aldane. With just a week to go before the UK general election 2024, I'm delighted to be speaking to author of Alchemy and Transport for Humans, Rory Sutherland. Well, this episode was due to be recorded in the Cucumber restaurant just downstairs, but we're sat on the roof terrace of the Sea Containers, the building that houses the advertising firm Ogilvy. And I'm sat here with Rory Sutherland, Vice Chairman and author of the 2019 bombshell book, Alchemy, The Magic of Original Thinking in a World of Mind-Numbing Conformity, and co-author of a more recent book, Transport for Humans, Are We Nearly There Yet? Rory, first of all, apart from the obvious, it being in the same building as the place you work, why have you chosen Cucumber?
I have to admit it was partly diary dependent, but I'm very, very fond of Cucumber. It's our own in-house restaurant with our own fantastic mixologist. The building is shared between a whole mix of WPP companies, and I think sensibly the restaurant operates as a separate profit-making entity in its own right, obviously with, some concessions made to in-house staff. And it also, this is why we can't actually sit there downstairs at the moment, it also hosts events. And so occasionally it gets closed off.
And so it's closed for lunch
events.
Today, yes.
So we've adopted very much, the Jeff Bezos approach. Jeff Bezos's approach, of course, is that every component of Amazon sells itself independently. So you have Amazon Web Services, for example, you have Amazon Payment. I keep ranting on to them about getting the locker system effectively opened up to external use. You can use Amazon Delivery for products that you've sold on your own website, for instance, Amazon Logistics. And so we've done that with our in-house restaurant, effectively. It is, in a sense, part of our business, but it's also effectively its own profit centre, which I think makes it not only more lucrative, but also makes it a better restaurant, to be honest. I was very taken, years ago I stayed in San Francisco in one of the very early Kimpton hotels. And what I thought was very clever is normally the hotel cafe or hotel restaurant is an integral part of the hotel. It feels fundamentally alienating to anybody who isn't a guest at the hotel, and generally the vibe isn't all that exciting. And the Kimpton Group seem to have pioneered something which is actually more common with American city hotels now, where your kind of breakfast cafe is a cafe for the whole community. And in fact, to anybody walking past, it wouldn't be evident that this were part of the hotel. You don't have to go in through the hotel entrance. It's got its own separate entrance to the street. What does happen is that hotel guests can come down and obviously sign their Eggs Benedict to the room if they want to. And when I first came across this in the mid-90s, that struck me as a pretty damn clever thing to do, because it created a vibe in the cafe which no hotel breakfast room could ever really recreate.
And this same vibe you think adheres in...
I hope so, yes, because we actually get people coming in who aren't us. I think that helps.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
Well, this is the first time that I've been inside the Sea Containers building. I was saying to your assistant, Anna, earlier, that in my first year of university, everyone would always flock to the Oxo Tower because that felt like the place to be, as though we could afford it. But we went there anyway. That was always a fun time.
Where were you at university?
I was studying philosophy at Haythrop in Kensington.
Ah, right, interesting. Any particular field of philosophy? I'm intrigued.
The modules I took were phenomenology. I studied Soren Kierkegaard. That was a particularly immersive...
gruelling experience.
Yeah, not as gruelling as Kant. I'm glad I never touched him. But yeah, that and Wittgenstein.
Bizarrely, I've been described by people who know more about these things than I do as a phenomenologist, or occasionally an epistemologist.
And an existentialist, surely.
Don't know. I'm not sure I'd bracket myself there, but what certainly is sort of phenomenological about it is that there is this yawning gulf between what we measure objectively and how we emotionally perceive and react to things. And it strikes me as essentially ridiculous in large parts of life that we optimize for reality, not for perception.
Well, this is why I mentioned existentialism, because I know you have the classic Englishman's disdain for the existentialist. I can tell in the way that you responded to that.
Automatic kind of French film every goddamn time.
Yeah.
Absolutely happy to sit. In fact, to be honest, in my taste in movies, I'm a bit of a pretentious tosser, really happy to sit down and watch Last Year in Marian Bad, or At Marian Bad. The British, I always wondered which it was, and the British and American titles were different for some reason. Totally happy to watch a bit of French art house. When it comes to philosophy, I shy away because it's all a bit too... Well, the language is... Not having Anglo-Saxon words, I think, is a fundamental, disadvantage in philosophy.
Well, listen...
Because you get abstract too quickly.
3 years of phenomenology will teach you to want to park that for the rest of your life.
But nevertheless, what I talk about, I think, interestingly crops up in things, for example, like algorithm design, where it's known as the alignment problem, which is, that would also crop up in artificial intelligence. How do you actually define the purpose of something technological? Or how do you optimize something while being confident that you are actually optimizing for human taste rather than for, effectively gaming some metric absurdly, which I think often happens, by the way.
Absolutely. Well, look, this is why you wrote Alchemy in part, right? Logic versus magic, facts versus feelings, reality versus perception, economics versus psychology. You've written and spoken a lot over the course of your career about why not just understanding but mastering the distinction between these things matters to getting people to buy into ideas. But with the next UK general election on the horizon for the 4th of July, I thought we'd talk a bit about why the same mastery of psychology should matter to people trying to run a country, and whether we need more alchemists in politics and policy making.
Emphatically, yes. Very interestingly, possibly one of the less fashionable Conservative politicians is Grant Shapps. And he's slightly unfashionable because he's a little bit blingy, and his background was not in something tedious but respectable like law, but was actually effectively as a huckster and salesman. And what I keep noticing is that when you talk to civil servants or people in government who are particularly engaged with psychological questions of perception and behaviour, he's kind of their favourite minister, which is interesting because you suddenly realise that marketing, sales and, even market research skills, understanding consumer behaviour and understanding citizen behaviour is a skill hugely unrepresented in government. This is a great quote from Richard Thaler. I think it's in an article he wrote in the Wall Street Journal, probably, or New York Times, where he said, in Washington, politicians talk to lawyers who occasionally seek advice from economists. No one else interested in helping the lawyers out need apply. And actually, a background in law or a background in economics is almost the worst possible, dogmatic, reductionist, mechanistic mindset you could have for solving, I think, many complex problems where psychology plays a decisive part in success, and where actually, a legalistic mindset is actually a positive disadvantage, I would argue, to solving many, many problems.
So just briefly then, for those who aren't familiar with your work, what do you mean by the term alchemy?
There is a very, very strong heuristic, which is you can't get something for nothing, and that effectively the scale of the effect in any system is proportionate to the scale and indeed cost of the intervention. One of the things that makes politics incredibly stupid is that what politicians are really seeking is a headline announcement, which is, we've managed to strong-arm the Treasury into giving us an extra $5 billion to spend on this. I would argue that in solving those kind of problems, the amount of money is surprisingly irrelevant to the level of success you might have in achieving any particular human-focused end. And yet this idea of proportionality, that in other words, you can't get something for nothing. If you want to improve the NHS, we do need, by the way, more money to go to the NHS. I'm not disputing that. But that shouldn't be the first port of call. It should be the last port of call. What are the problems we can solve without money? And then when we've exhausted those, let's look at some of the more expensive problems. Instead, we almost seem to be doing it backwards. And so this idea of proportionality, which I think comes from the fact that the majority of people in both business and government tend to have a mechanical engineering mental model of how the world works, where everything serves a single designated purpose, and that if you optimize the parts, you will magically optimize the whole. That's kind of engineering, simple engineering mindset. Not a sophisticated engineering mindset by any means. And actually, complementary to that mindset, I'm not suggesting that sometimes that isn't a useful kind of mental model to hold. You actually need one that comes from something like evolutionary biology or complexity theory or meteorology or some kind of complex system where small interventions can actually have very, very decisive effect.
And this is alchemy.
Alchemy is effectively an acknowledgement, I suppose, that there are scale factors in problem solving, and that you don't necessarily need to intervene at a large scale to have a large-scale effect. What's strange is that when you successfully do that, you're met... This is partly why it's called alchemy, because, the whole idea of alchemy was something for nothing. You could turn base metals into gold. And my argument is that chemically, well, you can actually do it. I think it requires a lot of energy or something. But chemically, you may not be able to do that. But if your job is to make a base metal seem as valuable as gold, you can do that. Psychological alchemy, because psychology is, again, complex, disproportionate. There are butterfly effects all over the place in psychology. Because of that, it can be surprisingly easy to obtain fairly large effects with very small interventions. Now, I'm by no means the first person to say this. I mean, Buckminster Fuller, on his gravestone, it says, "Call me Trim Tab." And the trim tab for Buckminster Fuller was, I think, the part of the aeroplane or the ship. I think it's a sort of extra little sort of aileron at the end of a rudder or at the end of a kind of winglet or whatever, where the smallest intervention has the greatest possible effect. And there are places where you can intervene, often surprising places, counterintuitive places, where you can achieve those trimmed tab effects. Small changes have disproportionate effect on the outcome, and yet we don't look for them because instead we're fixated with this belief in terms of sort of general proportionality and symmetry in the things we do.
I was wondering what the interest has been among people who work in politics or economics in your work over the years, and what have they told you about its impact on their own work? Do they say to you, look, Rory, this is all very well for a creative ad agency, but there's no trim tab that we can simply fit to the NHS. There's no psychological trick that we can play to make...
Yes, there are. There are lots of them.
Well, do they say this?
No, just to be clear, okay, I think creative people have made a very bad mistake, ironically, including advertising agencies and how they sell creativity. And we've tended to sell it in two ways, neither of which is very clever. One of which is it's the end of the process where we add a bit of icing, cherry, magic dust to the rational grunt work that's been done previously. In other words, we'll take the wonderfully rational stuff that all you people have done and we'll just add a little bit of fairy dust. I think that's a terrible underestimation of what creativity can do. The second one is to take creativity and always use it in opposition to rationality. I mean, I read a lot about economics. I find economics highly interesting because occasionally a very mathematical, ludicrously reductionist approach to problems reveals, nonetheless, all models are wrong, but some of them are useful, right? It reveals things which are nevertheless potentially enlightening or interesting. I want no objection with the use of rational models, but what we've done is we basically said all that rationality stuff is bollocks. What you need is creativity, which is the other kind of what you might call the provisional wing of the creative army. Okay, rather than just adding magic fairy dust, actually I would regard creativity and rationality as parallel mental assets which should be deployed simultaneously.
A different way of asking questions.
Rather than, they're not in opposition to each other, there's a yin and yang. I suspect that people in Eastern philosophy would understand this far better, actually. I've got a Hindu friend who accuses Westerners of what he calls monotheism, which is the extension of monotheism, which is you need one thing to explain everything. And he said, look, my mum goes to a church in India, well, a temple in India, technically, and on the altar, there's a monkey, there's an elephant, and there's Jesus, okay? And there's no particular discontent with the idea that these things might be contradictory or, they're simply seen as complementary. And we're not very good at that, I think. I blame the French. Have you ever read a book by John Ralston Saul called Voltaire's Bastards? Is that right?
I haven't read it, but I've heard of it, yeah.
Yeah, and his contention is that what went wrong in the sort of French Enlightenment period, not so much the Scottish Enlightenment, which was pretty pragmatic and, pretty commonsensical in many ways, but it caused the French to kind of effectively prize reason on its own and used on its own as the dominant form of problem solving. And Ralston Saul would say, look, he lists 6 qualities. He's Canadian, so he's probably pretty sensible. He puts them in alphabetical order, and it's something like, I think it's creativity, common sense, actually that's reverse, common sense, creativity, memory, ethics, well that would go first, wouldn't it? Reason, is that 6? I might have forgotten one of them.
I think that's 5.
That's 5. 6 is actually one too many, John, if you want people to remember a list. Reason, ethics, memory, common sense, creativity, and something else. Anyway, his point is that these are all human gifts. And the reason we have all these gifts is that they, in a sense, counterweight each other. Deploying reason in the absence of ethics leads to, well, I think we can look at parts of the 20th century and see where exactly that led, okay? And therefore, this business of actually regarding reason as the only decisive kind of criterion for good decision-making actually leads to grotesque distortion. This is very similar, I suspect, to Ian McGilchrist and his idea of effectively, the essential problem of over-left brain dominance. And you see this in business because people define problems as close-ended problems so that they can have a single right answer, just like their high school maths exam. It terrifies me that IQ tests are multiple choice, right? Because if you judge intelligence simply by giving people multiple choice questions, all you are actually measuring is their ability to answer the kind of question where there's a single right answer. Most real-world questions, like who do you marry, where do you live, where do you open an office, should I buy that hat, do not... I sometimes tease my brother about this. My brother's an astrophysicist. I always say that if you actually took him to IKEA and said, OK, you can't come home until you've chosen a sofa, he's starved to death there. You'd need to send someone with him to go, Will, buy the fucking sofa, OK? And the reason is that because there isn't a sort of single optimizing algorithm for sofa selection, he'd find that kind of decision deeply painful. I've got another friend who's a mathematician who lives within sight of here, who would literally spend, if he had to buy a new monitor for his computer, probably he'd spend 3 months researching it. I mean, I'm literally, okay? Now, you've got to remember, in the evolutionary environment, there is an advantage to making slightly suboptimal decisions quite quickly. What most of us do is go, well, IKEA stocked this, and it seems to have been selling quite well for quite a time. So I think we can confidently say this sofa isn't shit. And so now, accepting that, I'll just use subjective judgment. There are a few little good tips. Don't buy a 3-seater sofa, by the way. Absolute waste of time, because the person sitting in the middle of a 3-seater sofa has an absolutely horrible time.
It's true. It's like being in the middle of the seat of a car, isn't it?
Exactly that, yeah. On the middle seat of those fucking trains, which have 3 abreast seating, where everybody hates the middle seat. But so there are some little useful, rational rules you can apply. But it's basically, we're using a mixture of different mental tools. We're using a sort of diverse mental toolkit. And what seems to have happened at some point is that someone said, no. If you can pretend that this is a rational problem and you can solve it rationally, what you therefore arrive at is demonstrably the perfect answer, compared to which anything else is wrong or suboptimal. Now, I'll give you an example of this, okay? High speed 2, we can't quite see St Pancras from here. The brief was given to a bunch of engineers who defined the objective of high speed 2 in entirely mechanical terms, in terms of speed, capacity, frequency of service, I guess, cost, okay? And they had a mathematical model which was utter toss, which basically said that every 3 minutes of journey time reduced the economic value of the project by 2.5 billion, or it might have been even more. Ove Arup actually had a very good plan, or it might have been Arup. They had a really good plan to run it along the M40, where, of course, it would have caused minimal disruption, not much tunnelling. That would have made the journey about 7 minutes longer, and in their model, that made it something like £12 billion less valuable. Utter toss, right? In what world does someone go, I would go to Manchester today, but it takes 8 minutes too long?
In our world, apparently. I mean, it's just, it's crazy.
My question is, what have you given the brief for High Speed 2 to Disney, right? What they would have said, assuming it was a train, and they may say, actually, what we'll do is we'll produce a replica of the Hogwarts Express between London and Manchester, which means that 30% of American tourists, even though it takes 2 hours, will actually visit Manchester during their visit to London. Or they might have said, let's build a massive theme park in Manchester, a theme park of, like, really annoying music or something, and we'll get lots of people together. But if you'd given them the train brief, the question they would have asked would be, how do we make the journey between London and Manchester by train so enjoyable that people feel stupid going by car? Now, why does that question not get asked? Why instead do we ask the question about time, speed, distance, blah, blah, blah? And the answer is because that's an open-ended question which gives room for creative solutions. You could say, OK, we're going to have kids' carriages with a fucking ball pit, right? We're going to actually have little meeting rooms on the train. Maybe the journey will take an hour and a half or 2 hours, but you can actually book a little meeting room with high-speed Wi-Fi. We'll make the wait on the station absolutely opulent and glorious, or we'll turn Euston Station into, I don't know, roller coaster. Open-ended questions absolutely terrify bureaucrats. So we have this absolute bureaucratic horror of subjective decision-making, which effectively means that no brief is allowed to leave any scope for creative judgment, because to do so would actually involve some degree of ambiguity. All real-world decisions should actually embrace and cherish ambiguity and say, well, look, there are 5 ways of looking at this, and it's not all about speed and time and distance.
I asked earlier whether people in politics or economics had read your work and had said that it had had a positive impact on their work, and I think probably the evidence from what we see around us is that it hasn't yet.
Because the Overton window now is so narrow, but the Overton window is also looking at things which most people don't care about that much. So there's a sort of blurry thing about slightly higher taxes, slightly lower taxes, da-da-da-da-da. Now, I partly blame the left for this, okay, because where I would have happily supported left-wing parties would be if they actually bit the bullet and said, we need to tax income a bit less and wealth a bit more. As a conservative, small c conservative, I do accept that it's the role of government to provide adequate incentives and rewards to enterprise, risk-taking, and creation in the marketplace, okay?
That is where you and I have common ground. You're a Georgist, aren't you?
Georgist,
We can talk about Henry George in a moment.
It's not the job of conservatism to create dynastic wealth, okay? It's not the job of conservatism to allow people late in life to pile up a huge amount of their wealth in a totally illiquid form with basically... Okay, this literally, I think, depicts about 10% of the British population, which is 2 people living in a 4-bedroom house worth £900,000 who are worried about the price of lemons.
Yes, I heard you say recently that you sometimes have nightmares that your time in creative advertising or the advertising industry has been a waste of time.
Totally wasted. All I've done is give people, not me, obviously, I played a very small part in giving people ever better, cheaper consumer goods.
That's
better
right.
Broadband, cheaper broadband, so that the money we have saved them can basically prop up an absurdly inflated property market.
The structure of the economy has meant that better and cheaper goods become a substitute for real wealth.
Now here's a really... she was never a colleague of mine. We never overlapped. But one of Ogilvy's previous employees was Faye Weldon. Now, the reason I have to say that Faye Weldon said this is because otherwise I'm going to sound like some kind of antediluvian sexist. But most of the gains of the double-income household, okay... Initially, the fact that women were free to work was an option, okay? And it was rather nice, because if you wanted more money and a bit less free time, you had this wonderful option where you could both go to work. I'll tell you a story, actually, from the early days of mobile phones. There was some research done by either Vodafone or what was then Cellnet. And this was when mobile phones cost about 25 quid a month. Expensive, bear in mind. But in the late 80s, that was a lot of money. And by the way, it was about 50p to a pound a minute to make a call. And they went and researched kind of tradesmen, plumbers, etc. And they didn't expect much take-up because it was an expensive, yuppie product. And they're absolutely amazed because in every single room full of plumbers, painters, decorators, they went, yeah, I'll get one of those. And they're going, well, this is quite expensive. And they said, yeah, but you see, I don't need my wife to stay at home anymore taking calls to book my appointments. So I can buy one of these phones and send her outdoors to work in the pub, okay? Which will more than pay for the cost of the phone. Well, it's a wonderful case where quite often people on the ground have a kind of mathematics that, you can't see from a distance.
Yeah.
Now, ultimately what happened, and this happens with a lot of technology, we need to be really alert to it, and it's one reason why I'm very sympathetic to the occasional Luddite argument, which is a lot of technology arrives as an option and ends up as an obligation. And the dual-income household, to some extent, okay, great for the government, because you've got twice as many people paying tax. Brilliant for people who already owned property, because the value of property went up to a point, suddenly, where it was no longer an option for both of you to work because you couldn't afford housing or to bring up a family without two salaries unless one of you was spectacularly rich, already had property, or was unfeasibly highly paid. So now, just to be clear, this is not me saying, back in the kitchen, right? The two people who've said this most vociferously are Fay Weldon and Elizabeth Warren. The interesting thing with Elizabeth Warren, okay, she's regarded by Americans as like a left-wing whack job. Okay, she is a Democratic senator for Massachusetts, I think, am I right? But everything she says strikes me as being almost unbelievably sane. I mean, I'd vote for her in a heartbeat for President of the United States. And yet, for some reason, Americans regard her as barking mad.
But they do, don't they, for anyone who veers slightly left? I mean, she is rooting for Main Street, isn't she, in American parlance?
Yes, she did some interesting work on consumer protection. Weirdly, although I work in advertising, if I had time and energy for a second career, I would actually go into consumer protection. Now, that's not because in my 36 years in advertising, I've seen many times when advertising or marketing people, who tend to be quite consumer-focused, okay, I haven't actually seen many things that ethically horrify me in 35 years, maybe 3, and they weren't here at this agency. They were things told to me by other people. There was one case where there was a meeting, in fairness they didn't enact it, where someone in the bank said, actually, if we move the bank charges forward 5 days, they'll hit people before payday, so they'll go over their overdraft limit, and we can hit them with more bank charges the following month. Now, they didn't enact that, but they were thinking it, okay? That's just one story of something I heard from a completely different agency, none of our clients, just to be clear about it. But equally, I've only heard about 4 things like that kind of horrify me. There is, however, a problem, which is a simple evolutionary problem, which is that companies that work out how to hack human psychology, we have to be really alert to kind of AI-powered advertising, because if you have something like a gambling problem or a gambling addiction, through a simple evolutionary process not involving any conscious intent, this process will discover weaknesses. It will effectively discover weaknesses in human resistance.
Well, we've seen this already with social media platforms.
With social media platforms, exactly, yeah. And so, there are 2 reasons to, learn behavioural science, one of which, and they're both equally valid, one of which is to find ways of persuading people to do things, finding ways to persuade people to consider things as an option which they may not previously have considered. I don't think you can regard that as controversial. Okay? In other words, improving people's choice architecture and effectively, choice improvement is an economic good, I think. And the other one is actually spotting where the system goes badly wrong. Sludge, as Richard Thaler calls it. Most subscription to online publications is a racket in that it's very easy to sign up and almost impossible to cancel. Those kind of things have to be... By the way, those kind of things have to be actually outlawed for the benefit of legitimate publications, because we've now created a world where nobody's prepared to subscribe to anything because once bitten, twice shy. So, no, I'm very interested in consumer protection, because I think it is absolutely essential to honest and legitimate players in any marketplace that the overall market is not discredited by bad apples. And so I think that's a really important issue.
Let's talk about the American political economist Henry George. His ideas have relevance now more than ever, particularly when you mentioned earlier asymmetries of wealth tied up in inert assets.
Well, I wrote in the Spectator, okay, I'm not a capitalist, I'm a consumerist. I'm interested in consumers being able, as far as they are able, to make the best of their lives through being able to make intelligent choices which pay off in the long term. And, you've got to be very careful about anti-consumerism. I read things from the 1960s where literally there was a sociologist saying, I rather despair at increasing the wealth of the working class because they tend to spend their money on pointless luxuries like washing machines. You go, what? Okay. I mean, literally, in the 1960s, something like the washing machine was viewed by sociologists, who almost certainly already had a washing machine themselves, okay, as a pointless luxury. Now, that's bizarre when you read it, okay? Do you think it's a pointless luxury?
It may have been a luxury at the time, but I don't think it was pointless.
No, you could define it as a luxury in that it was expensive, undoubtedly, but it probably freed women to enter the workforce to a degree.
Certainly not pointless.
It certainly gave you back probably 8 hours of your time every week. And it also... Now, there are downsides to it, which is now you're pretty much obliged to put on a clean shirt every day. I mean, it's worth noting that we're obliged by social norms to wash things more frequently than we did because everybody has a washing machine, so norms of cleanliness have perhaps become a bit ridiculous.
Yeah.
But no, when I say I'm a consumerist, what I'm saying is that it strikes me as extraordinary, okay, that let's say there's somebody over there who's 27 years old, they're a corporate lawyer, and they're earning £170,000 a year, and they haven't got any family money behind them, and they decide they're going to buy a 3-bedroom flat in Fulham, okay, upper or garden flat in Fulham. And they go and buy the damn thing, which is £900,000, which means that for the next 20 years, the greater part of their discretionary income will be spent acquiring something that a poor person would have owned 100 years ago. Now, that's not progress, is it?
No.
Okay, so I'm going to bankrupt myself and enrich a bunch of financial institutions, stroke empty nesters, stroke old people who happen to buy property at a lucky time. I'm going to spend a large part of my working life doing that, and the sum total of my achievement is to have something which in 1920 would have been regarded as substandard accommodation.
But in the meantime, you can buy this great variety of cheap toiletries.
Yes.
And package holidays.
That's good. Well, I suppose healthcare, education, one of the things that still maintain scarcity value. So there are luxury goods which maintain it artificially. And if you look at prices over time, all the things, washing machines, televisions, broadband, broadband is absurd, okay? I mean, I'm old enough to remember when you paid £20-something a month, and now it's literally astronomically faster for no more money, okay? And nearly everything that is mass-produced that is of vague use, with the exception of luxury goods, education, healthcare in the US, I guess, and property, we are unimaginably wealthy compared to my parents' generation. In terms of property, we're complete paupers compared to my father's generation.
That's right, it's the new serfdom, isn't it?
It is effectively the new serfdom.
Neo-feudalism.
It would help if you young people would actually discover suburbia. Okay, there's an awful lot of image at work here. I had a colleague, wonderful guy, called Paul Hargreaves, who was art director, Kiwi. And his great prediction was that in 10 to 15 years' time, suburbia would become cool. Okay, like art directors and ad agencies would go, I managed to get a mock Tudor house, and I got one of those Atco lawnmowers, and we got a bit of, stained glass above the door. It doesn't help that young people are absolutely fixated with, the trappings of a highly urban lifestyle,
But weren't you when you were young?
Yeah. I'll tell you a very funny story.
And isn't that to do with sex drive, ultimately?
No, because I was already in a relationship.
No. I mean, why are young people attracted to urban environments?
So you've got to admit that Tinder in Cornwall's probably going to be a bit disappointing outside the holiday season.
Or just being around so much soil. I mean, it's anti-life, isn't it? Just to be clear,
it is actually slightly tragic.
Just to be clear, when I said that soil is anti-life, obviously not. Life is teeming beneath the ground. But my point is, and I guess I'm riffing off of the poetry of Frank O'Hara here, when he writes in praise of New York, I mean, he's channeling that perennial drive that young people have towards monuments to creativity and innovation and a sense of possibility. And as gravity acts on us as we get older, we seem to go closer and closer to the ground until we're gardening.
Okay, if you strip out nightclubs, theatres, nightlife, which I'm 58. I'm not a huge theatre goer. I'll go occasionally, but hell, I live in Sevenoaks. It's half an hour on the train, and the train deposits you in Charing Cross, which is by far the greatest station in London, because it is actually where you want to be in London. But if you strip out those things, when I was, 25, it's worth noting that I grew up in a Welsh market town. Retail in London was an order of magnitude better, okay? Restaurants, eating out, variety of food, orders of magnitude better in London. Actually, the internet combined with the general improvement of provincial towns and cities has narrowed that gap pretty starkly, okay? I mean, I'm not sure. If you said, do you want to spend 3 days on an eating journey, say, round London or Manchester? Okay, in 1988, that would have been an absolute slam dunk. I mean, Manchester wouldn't have had a look in. I'm probably being a little bit unfair. I'm sure there were great places. But now, and this comes back to the Georgist argument, I do worry that London property and rates have actually become so expensive there's no longer any experimentation. When I want to go and find really interesting cafes, I go to East Kent. I go to Margate or somewhere.
Will Storr, who wrote the book The Status Game,
fantastic book.
His favourite restaurant, were we able to go there, would have been Long Clume, which I think is based in Cumbria.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very far-flung.
Yeah.
I'd still love to go. Talking earlier about the way the decisions are made and on which metric, it all boils down to, as you say, logic and the dominance, the tyranny of logic. Logical decisions kind of give politicians an alibi when things go wrong.
Yes, when we arrive at solutions rationally, we tell everybody, look, we arrived at them rationally. And when we arrive at solutions creatively, we post-rationalize and pretend we arrived at them rationally.
That's interesting. But then when logical ideas fail, as I was saying, politicians still have an alibi.
You see, our alibi is...
Nobody can accuse them of having done anything on impulse. Absolutely. And that's why they do it in the first place, isn't it? They don't want to be embarrassed by the thought that they took an unnecessary risk.
Absolutely right. And also, you can't invest £8 million in media because some people in a room talked shit for 3 days until they got lucky. You have to pretend the whole thing is arrived at through sequential steps of inexorable, logical induction or deduction. There's a thing called abductive inference, isn't there? Which is...
Isn't abduction when a doctor has to start with the symptoms and work back through what possible causes?
I think it's what Conan Doyle called reasoning backwards.
Right.
So there's induction and deduction. I can never remember what the bloody difference is, but they're slightly different. But there's this third thing. A guy called Charles Sanders Peirce is the guy, is an American philosopher, who said, no, there's a third thing, which is abductive inference, which is almost like... And a way of describing it is that it's an answer to a question that hasn't been asked yet. And I always argue, if you want to solve the world's problems, there are probably far more good ideas we can post-rationalize than there are good ideas we can pre-rationalize. And if you make rationalization a prerequisite for any kind of proposed decision or solution, evolution doesn't work that way. Okay? It's simply random variation followed by selection. Evolution definitely works backwards. Okay. And I would argue, competitive markets work that way. It's actually mostly backwards. Most extraordinary things. Are you interested? Because this is a restaurant blog, one of the things that absolutely fascinates me is how many of my attempts to predict the success or failure of a restaurant have been so badly wrong it's unimaginable. The guy in Sevenoaks who bought the location of a restaurant location where every previous person had failed spectacularly. Nobody went there. And he turned it into an upmarket, I'll give them a plug, Hattusha. He turned it into an upmarket Turkish restaurant. I was there going, please don't do that. That location is cursed. I don't want to see you doing this. You're spending a fortune on the end. Fantastic success. I went yesterday to a place called Eton Mess, which is a gluten-free kind of cafe just outside Sevenoaks on a rather obscure road, which I think is the B2211 or something, between sort of Sevenoaks, of all places, Sundridge and Otford. And again, I thought they'd moved out of the town, Sevenoaks, where they'd had a cafe which was marginally successful. Again, I thought, okay, these people are basically bonkers. Who would go to a cafe which is kind of on a bit of a farm? So I actually recorded a podcast there yesterday on the assumption to be really quiet. First thing in the morning, opens at 8 o'clock, heaving. And actually, if you think about restaurant opening, I think I said that Tony Cattouse said this about Comptoir Libanais. He said, actually, there are obviously stupid decisions like opening a restaurant in the middle of a field, and there are obviously brilliant solutions, probably like opening a coffee shop in a railway station that doesn't have a coffee shop. Okay, there are solutions which rationally are slam dunks, but actually a hell of a lot of the restaurant industry will always have to be basically try and see what happens, maybe pivot, maybe fail, maybe expand. And the restaurant industry is, in a sense, perhaps one of the most Darwinist of all the parts of sort of free market capitalism. Because, I love studying it partly because it's a really healthy reminder of how wrong I can be. Genuinely, I've actually pitied people opening places which turn out to be sensationally successful. And who would have known? Why is that restaurant, the B2211, the cafe? God knows.
Well, you may have been wrong about a lot of things, but you are right about so much in this book. Again, we do need more alchemists in government.
Well, the entrepreneur has a unique privilege because they have investors and they have other people, but generally the investor is betting on the entrepreneur as a person.
Yes.
Okay, there's a business plan, obviously, although that might change a lot. But they don't have to pre-rationalize everything they do. And that allows them to explore territories which larger organizations can't even enter. What you're betting on in capitalism is you're betting on a worldview. My view of the future is that this is going to happen, and I'm betting on the fact that when presented with this, people will see it in this way. And that is never going to be an exact science. And sometimes, by the way, sometimes, let's face it, a huge amount of luck is involved. They're brilliant, brilliant online ideas which just got the timing wrong. I still think Google Glass was a great idea. I'm still annoyed that I can't buy them.
Have you tried them on before?
No, I never got to try them because partly it was user imagery. They only gave them to developers who, let's face it, with the best will in the world, probably aren't the coolest people you'll ever find.
I saw one man wear it once at the World Bank annual conference, and he was the only one wearing them in his group of friends, and he looked frankly mad, just distracted by an invisible moth just above his eyebrow.
But actually, having something in my eye which would say your next meeting starts in 10 minutes, it's going to rain in 5 minutes, just having what in rolling news is the lower third, and the TV, rolling news, updates, this has happened, that has happened. That level of augmentation of reality actually appeals to me a lot more than entering a completely surreal parallel universe using Apple Vision Pro, while possibly feeling slightly sick.
Name 3 easy wins for the next government that would cost next to nothing and have a sizable positive effect.
To get elected, really easy. You cancel all environmental programs, you frack like crazy, and you promise everybody in the UK a hot tub. The reason I'm mischievously saying this is that if we're being completely honest, we can get people to behave in far more environmental ways, but not necessarily by appealing to their environmental consciousness. It occurred to me that electric cars, and I write for the Spectator, it's a right-wing magazine with some, not all, quite a lot of older readers. And whenever I write approvingly about electric cars, about the fact that they're just great cars to drive, I get this massive pushback, typically from older people. And I suddenly realized people without electric cars, all think that the people driving electric cars are holier-than-thou environmentalists who are sneering at them for driving a diesel. Absolute bollocks. There is no correlation. I'm willing to bet if we went and looked at TGI data, there is absolutely no correlation. There may even be an inverse correlation between electric car ownership and commitment to environmental causes. You get some really weird things, Brighton, with a Green MP, for a long time had the worst recycling record in Britain. I always noticed the fact that when I first had an electric car, if you needed to charge it in Brighton or Cambridge, i.e. major woke centres, you had absolutely no chance. You go to Billericay in Essex, and there were high-speed chargers coming out of the wazoo, right? No, things government can do, we have to shift. Far too much of the tax burden is being borne in the shape of income tax, particularly by the young. We have to actually, in a sense, tax the property market. We have to introduce Georgist. One of the problems, in fairness, with new taxes is that every time the government introduces a new tax, they don't remove another one. And so voters, not unreasonably, are massively hostile to any form of new taxation because they see it purely as incremental. Now, a proper Georgist campaign to tax land value, it would need to have some pretty good exemptions. I would also extend the tax to non-renewable energy as well. I would basically say, non-renewable energy and land are actually not goods that are created. They're an endowment to the country the gains from which should be shared equitably. All right? You're a Georgist as well, are you?
I am.
Yeah. Okay. There's a group called Patriotic Millionaires. There's a very interesting podcaster called Scott Galloway, who you may have heard. I'm also hugely conscious of the fact that the tax system needs root and branch reform, because all we're doing is tinkering with something which is discouraging effort, enterprise, risk-taking, and expertise and effort, okay, and rewarding, effectively, unearned wealth. The argument is always, no, but you can't possibly give me, impose death duties because I already paid tax on that money. There are loads of things we pay tax on twice. I paid income tax and then I go and buy a telly. I have to pay VAT on the bloody thing, okay? Incidentally, the death duties aren't paid by the person who died in any case, because that person is by definition dead. They're paid by people who receive a massive windfall for doing absolutely bugger all, apart from having a parent who happened to be born in a lucky time in a lucky place. We have to drive empty nesters out of their homes to some degree. Brutal. We have to stop fetishizing the old, okay?
Do you believe we live in a gerontocracy?
Government, the Conservative Party has become gerontophile. It is triple lock on pensions and things like that.
Well, the quadruple lock that it's flirting with.
Quadruple lock now, okay. So, okay, let's be blunt about this, okay? When I was a kid, and all the time up until I was about 25, 30, maybe until I was 35, when I was a very young kid, pensioners had fought in World War I, okay? Or they'd gone through World War I, or they'd fought in World War II, or they'd had to live in fairly major austerity conditions. My dad, born in 1930, he had a pretty, his what should have been the most fun time of his life was led in the 1950s, which was a pretty grim time. I mean, he was actually relatively fairly wealthy. He didn't have a bad time, come to think of it. But a hell of a lot of people had a pretty dismal time in those decades. And yet, weirdly, pensioners have somehow managed to hijack our affection for Captain Tom, okay, and apply it to a generation who basically, had final salary pensions, went to the Isle of Wight Festival, spent the 1970s with high union power being actually quite well paid and not working very hard, okay? We shouldn't fetishize these same people and reward them for doing nothing. Okay?
But stories, as you know, matter so much to selling ideas, and it seems that we only have one story now in modern Britain, and that is D-Day. We don't have another story to replace it, and if we don't get one soon...
Here's the first point I do, and this is not entirely me, it's Roger L. Martin. Canadian, again, business guru. Read all his stuff. He's the heir to Peter Drucker, I would say. And he nearly persuaded the Canadian Conservative Party that people did not have $3,000, $5,000, $8,000, $10,000 of tax-free income every year. Instead, it was flipped through 90 degrees so that the first $120,000 you earned in Canada in your life was tax-free. And then you started paying tax on everything. So, in other words, it was a tax system that was back-end weighted. Okay? I would also argue that if you're going to pay 45% tax or 40% tax, you should only pay that tax rate when you have earned more than the threshold for 5 years or more. Now, where the Labour Party pissed me off is they go, tax cuts for millionaires. No. People earning £120,000 a year in household income are not millionaires. They're trying to be millionaires. In many cases, now, it always fascinated me where you'd think that bash the rich would play out well. Actually, if you look at it in a sort of a longitudinal way, a surprisingly large percentage of the population will find themselves in the top quartile of income earners at some point in their life. Now, we tend to go, there's a guy earning £150,000 a year, he's a corporate lawyer, wanker, he's going to earn that money all the way through his life, tax the bastard, okay? The majority of people, it may be that you've spent your life as an extremely hard-working teacher, and towards the end of your life you become deputy headmaster or headmaster of a fairly large state school, at which point, for the last 5 years of your working life, you hit the higher tax bracket, actually dramatically so. That higher tax bracket, Nigel Lawson never intended that to hit teachers, policemen, etc., okay? That was never intended. Now, in many ways, that 5 years of high earnings at the end of your life is a reward for work you put in previously, getting where you are now. And so it's interesting because there's another narrative asymmetry, okay? People on the left and people in politics tend to see high earners as people who just waltz into a high-paying job and then just earn a staggering amount of money for a hell of a long time. Most people in real life, either you're someone like a scaffolder, say, okay, in which just by freak variance you'll have 2 or 3 really high-earning years. You might be weirdly a footballer, in which case you have astoundingly high-earning years, but it doesn't last all that long. For many people, okay, you earn relatively modestly, but the last 5 years of your life, ka-ching, okay? The tax system does not. It assumes ergodicity. And this comes from, and this is where Gary Stevenson, the city boy?
Yes, that's right.
He is absolutely right. Okay, the single representative agent economic models have to be absolutely eliminated, because if you optimize for an average, first of all, there can be no inequality in a system where you're trying to optimize for an individual. There is no reasonable reason to assume that what increases average wealth will actually disperse those wealth gains equitably. And so we've had years of quantitative easing, we've had years of propping up the property market with low interest rates, which have net generated an increased average wealth, but in the most absurdly inequitable and disproportionate way. Let's go back right to the beginning, and I think this is where the problem started. Adam Smith, whom I venerate, introduced 3 components, because bear in mind, energy hadn't really factored in at that point, okay? 3 components to wealth creation: land, capital, labour. Subsequent economists conflated land and capital because it made the maths a lot easier if you had 2 things rather than you had 3. You know, you kind of got into the 3-body problem if you admitted that land wasn't the same as capital.
Right.
I think that fundamental conflation of land and capital is catastrophic, has been catastrophic for, decades and decades.
Has delivered what we face now.
This has created this ludicrous distortion where effectively capital has been kicking the shit out of labour for the last 20 to 30 years, largely with narrative, actually. So in other words, globalization, offshoring, immigration, etc. Whatever you think of their intrinsic goods, of which there are some, it's a very convenient narrative to the employer to suggest, don't go thinking about a pay rise, mate, because there's 27 of you, currently on a flight from Dubrovnik, whatever, right? Very convenient narratives to actually prevent wages from increasing. Okay, or we can just do the work somewhere low cost. See, the management never actually propose offshoring, do they? They never go, actually, why don't we just manage the company with some really good managers in the Philippines, and we'll all lose our jobs? No. For some reason, the managers have to be absolutely, they're absolutely intrinsic to the organisation, but everybody else isn't. But also, I think it's fair to say that land has been kicking the shit out of capital to a large extent. And so I don't think we'll actually solve politics without a root and branch reform of the tax system, which requires, of necessity, a fundamental redefinition of how wealth is created and distributed.
I knew you'd give the listeners a megaton to think about here. Thank you so much for joining me on the Booking Club. It's been an absolute delight.
Thank you very much.
And please,
indeed.
Anybody who's listening, check out Cucumber Restaurant.
Yeah, absolutely do that. Thank you.